It was the spring of 1945, in the shattered outskirts of Western Germany, where the war no longer sounded like marching armies, but like distant coughing artillery and collapsing roofs. The Third Reich was dying, but it was dragging children down with it. In a bombed-out village near the Rhine, the air smelled of damp soil, burnt timber, and fear that had nowhere left to hide. American troops had just secured the area after a brief firefight, expecting hardened enemy resistance. Instead, what they found was something far more unsettling. Against a broken stone wall stood a group of German boys, some no older than 12 or 13, wearing oversized uniforms that still smelled of factory starch and sweat. Their helmets slipped over their eyes, rifles heavier than their arms, fingers trembling near triggers they barely understood. These were not seasoned soldiers. These were children pulled from classrooms and cellars, rushed into the Volkssturm as the Reich's last, desperate breath. The boys believed they were about to die. They had been told Americans executed partisans. They had seen what war did to bodies. Their knees shook as boots approached. Some whispered prayers they barely remembered. Others stared straight ahead, trying to look like men, failing quietly. Even the American soldiers felt it. That sudden, heavy silence where victory tastes like ash. Orders were unclear. Emotions were not. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between justice, mercy, and the trauma of a world gone mad. Rifles were lowered. A jeep engine idled. And something utterly unexpected happened next. Something that no child soldier, no battlefield, and no history book could have prepared them. The American soldiers did not rush forward the way they had so many times before. There was no shouted command, no barked order to drop weapons, no sharp crack of rifle bolts being pulled back. Instead, there was a hesitation that crept into their steps, a slowing that came from instinct rather than training. These men had crossed oceans and bled across continents. They had stormed hedgerows and villages, where every shadow hid a gunman, where even a child could be a spotter or a messenger. Yet what stood in front of them now did not fit the shape of the enemy they had been conditioned to expect. The boys along the wall looked too small for their uniforms, sleeves hanging past their wrists, belts cinched tight to keep trousers from slipping. Their boots were mismatched, some stuffed with rags, others clearly taken from corpses or supply dumps. The rifles in their hands were real heavy and deadly, but the hands themselves were thin, pale, trembling in ways that no hardened soldier's hands ever did. One of the boys swallowed hard, his throat moving visibly as he stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Another kept glancing sideways at his friend, eyes wide, lips moving silently as if counting seconds or repeating a prayer he barely remembered. The Americans could smell them now, a mix of sweat, damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the sharp metallic scent of fear. It was a smell every frontline soldier knew well, but this time it felt wrong, like encountering it in a schoolhouse instead of a trench. Somewhere in the distance, artillery boomed, dull and far away, but here the world had narrowed to this frozen line of children and the men who had the power to decide their fate. A rifle slipped. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden movement, no attempt to run. The boy's fingers simply failed him. The weapon slid from his grasp and fell into the mud with a soft, ugly clatter. Every muscle in every body locked instantly. The boys flinched as one, shoulders tightening, eyes squeezing shut, the bracing for the sound they were sure would follow. Gunfire, shouting death. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, nothing happened. No shots rang out. No American raised his weapon. The rifle lay half submerged in mud, rainwater pooling along its barrel, utterly harmless. One of the American soldiers exhaled slowly, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Another muttered something under his breath, not a curse, but something closer to disbelief. The sergeant in charge took a step forward, then stopped. He had sons back home. He had taught one of them how to throw a baseball before the war, remembered the way small hands struggled to grip things meant for adults. Looking at these boys now, he saw that same struggle, the same mismatch between what they were and what they had been forced to become. The boys waited. Seconds stretched. Fear curdled into something heavier, something exhausting. They had been told stories of American brutality, of executions, of prisoners lined up and shot. Propaganda films had shown monsters, not men. And now the monsters were silent. Watching them with expressions the boys could not read. One boy's knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean back against the wall to stay upright. Another clenched his jaw so hard that blood trickled where he had bitten his own lip. Then something completely alien to the battlefield cut through the moment. Paper rustled. Not maps, not orders, food wrappers. An American soldier reached into his pack, movement slow and deliberate, as if he were afraid a sudden motion might shatter the fragile calm. He pulled out a hamburger, still wrapped in thin paper already darkening with grease. The smell hit the air immediately. Cooked meat, warm bread, fat and salt. It was an obscene smell on a battlefield, rich and comforting, and utterly out of place among ruins and corpses. The boy's eyes snapped open. Confusion replaced terror so quickly it was almost visible, like a physical shift in the air. The soldier hesitated for half a second, then held the hamburger out, arm extended, palm open. He said nothing. There was no speech prepared for this moment, no doctrine to follow. Another American followed suit, then another, each producing food like a magic trick no one believed was real. Burgers, bread, sometimes a chocolate bar. Not rations thrown on the ground, but offered carefully, person to person. One boy stared at the hamburger in front of him as if it were a trap. His hands shook violently now, not from cold, but from the effort of understanding what was happening. His stomach cramped painfully, reminding him just how long it had been since he had eaten anything more than watery soup or crusts of bread. Hunger fought with fear. Slowly, painfully, he reached out, fingers brushing the paper. When nothing happened, when no shot rang out, no shout followed, he took it fully into his hands. The warmth seeped into his palms. Another boy broke. He made a small, broken sound, halfway between a sob and a gasp, and tears spilled down his face without any attempt to stop them. He tried to wipe them away with his sleeve, but only smeared dirt across his cheeks. An American soldier knelt in front of him, lowering himself to eye level. Their faces were closed now, one lined with exhaustion and stubble, the other soft with youth and streaked with grime. The soldier gave a small nod, a gesture so simple it carried no threat at all. It said, "You're safe, at least for now." The boys began to eat, slowly, reverently, as if afraid the food might vanish if they rushed. Grace smeared their fingers. Crumbs fell into the mud. One boy closed his eyes as he took the first bite, chewing carefully, like he was afraid the sensation might overwhelm him. The taste was unlike anything he had known for months, rich, filling, real. His shoulders sagged as something inside him finally gave way, not in fear, but in relief so intense it hurt. Around them, the American soldiers stood awkwardly, unsure where to put their hands, unsure what to feel. Some looked away, suddenly uncomfortable, as if witnessing something too private. Others watched quietly, jaws tight, eyes dark. This was not victory as they had imagined it. There was no triumph here, no celebration. Only the heavy understanding that the war had gone so wrong that children had been dressed in uniforms and sent to die. The boys did not speak. They ate and cried and breathed, each action grounding them in the realization that they were still alive. Somewhere behind them, the ruined village creaked and groaned in the wind. Somewhere beyond that, the war raged on. But here, in this small pocket of shattered ground, something fragile and extraordinary had occurred. No orders had been given, no treaties signed, just a choice, quiet, human, and irreversible. The moment the first bites were taken, the entire atmosphere shifted in a way no artillery barrage ever could. Fear did not disappear instantly. It loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, like a clenched fist that had been tight for too long. The boys chewed with exaggerated care, eyes darting up every few seconds, as if expecting the spell to break. They had learned not to trust kindness. Kindness, in the world they had grown up in, usually came with a condition or a lie attached. Yet nothing followed. No shouting, no rifles raised. Just American soldiers standing there, breathing the same cold air, watching children eat instead of die. One of the Americans motioned gently for the boys to sit. The gesture was hesitant, almost shy, as if he were unsure whether he was allowed to suggest comfort in a place like this. The boys obeyed instinctively, lowering themselves onto broken stones, ammunition crates, chunks of collapsed wall. Rifles were taken from them one by one, not ripped away, but carefully lifted from their hands, muzzles pointed toward the ground, actions deliberate and calm. Each weapon removed seemed to peel another layer of terror from the boys' faces. Without the rifles, they looked even smaller, shoulders rounding inward, bodies folding back into something closer to what they truly were. Helmets came off next. One American gently lifted a steel helmet from a boy's head, revealing hair cut too short, scalp still bearing faint marks where clippers had scraped skin. Another helmet revealed a forehead smudged with soot and dried blood from a minor shrapnel cut that had never been properly treated. Without the helmets, the illusion of soldiers vanished completely. What remained were children, hollow-eyed, dirt-streaked, painfully thin. The Americans exchanged glances they would never speak aloud. No one had trained them for this. A medic knelt down, his movements practiced, but gentle. He checked wrists, eyes, wounds hidden beneath fabric stiff with sweat and grime. He murmured reassurances the boys didn't understand, but the tone mattered more than the words. Fingers pressed lightly against ribs that showed too clearly beneath skin. A bandage was wrapped around a small arm, with a tenderness usually reserved for civilians. For women and children, categories these boys had been stripped of by the uniform they wore. One boy winced as a medic cleaned a shallow wound, then relaxed when the pain faded quickly instead of worsening. Pain that ended felt like a miracle. As they ate, the boys began to notice details. One American had a wedding ring, dulled by grime. Another smelled faintly of tobacco and soap. Their uniforms were worn but intact, boots sturdy, faces tired in a way that spoke of distance traveled rather than hunger endured. These were not the monsters described in whispered warnings and state-issued pamphlets. These were men who looked like fathers, brothers, uncles, men who could have walked past a schoolyard without anyone looking twice. The realization unsettled the boys almost as much as the earlier fear had. One of the children finally spoke, His voice cracked so badly that the words almost collapsed before reaching the air. He said he had fired his rifle only once. Not at anyone, just into the sky. His hands shook again as he spoke, as if confessing to something shameful rather than something human. An American squatted nearby, listening closely, nodding once, slowly. Another boy admitted he had never fired at all. He had been handed the rifle that morning. His teacher had told him it was his duty. The word duty hung in the air, heavy and bitter. The Americans listened in silence. No one interrupted. No one challenged the stories. They had heard enough war to recognize truth when it stumbled out in fragments like this. Cigarettes were lit among the Americans, the soft scrape of matches sounding loud in the quiet that had settled over the ruins. Smoke curled upward, sharp and familiar. None were offered to the boys. Not out of cruelty, but instinct. Some lines were still remembered, even here. Instead, canteens were passed. Water sloshed, metal clinked. The boys drank greedily at first, then more slowly, realizing there would be more if they needed it. The silence deepened, but it was no longer the silence of terror. It was heavy, reflective, uncomfortable in a different way. Each American stood alone with his thoughts. They thought of brothers lost, of friends buried under foreign soil. They thought of orders followed without question, of lines crossed, because someone else had decided they must be. And now here were children who had been given the same commands, with none of the choice, none of the armor adulthood provided. Victory felt distant in that moment, abstract and hollow. Eventually, word traveled up the chain of command. Radios crackled softly. Orders came back, clear and unmistakable. These were not to be treated as enemy combatants. These were miners, civilians in uniform, victims of a collapsing regime. The boys did not understand the words, but they understood the shift in posture, the easing of shoulders, the way weapons stayed slung instead of ready. Trucks were requested. Not transport to camps behind barbed wire, but vehicles meant to move people out of danger. As the trucks approached, engines rumbling over broken ground, the boys stood slowly, stiff from cold and fear and hours of tension they had held inside their bodies. One boy clutched the last bite of his hamburger, unsure whether to finish it or save it, as if it might be taken away. An American motioned gently for him to eat it. He did, chewing carefully, eyes never leaving the soldier's face. Trust was forming, fragile and incomplete but real. The boys were guided toward the trucks, not herded, not shoved. Hands rested lightly on shoulders, steering without force. One child stumbled, legs weak, and an American steadied him without thinking, fingers gripping fabric instead of flesh. As they climbed into the truck beds, the boys turned back. Not all at once, but one by one. Their looks were not smiles. They were something quieter, heavier, a mix of confusion, gratitude, and a sadness too large for their age. The Americans stood and watched them go. No one waved. No one saluted. They simply stood there as the trucks pulled away, engines fading into the distance. The village grew quieter again. The war moved on, but something irreversible had happened in that place. A line had been drawn, not between sides, but between what the war demanded and what these men chose to do. And when the trucks finally rolled away, the sound of their engines faded into a distance already crowded with the echoes of war. But the silence they left behind felt different. It was not the hollow quiet that follows gunfire, nor the tense pause before another attack. It was reflective, weighted, and deeply unsettling. The American soldiers remained where they were, standing among rubble and broken stone, staring at the empty road as if something essential had been carried away with those children. The battlefield, for once, had not been marked by bodies. Yet the absence itself felt heavy, almost accusing. For the boys riding in the backs of the trucks, reality arrived in fragments. The vibration of the metal floor beneath them, the smell of oil and dust, the cold air stinging faces still damp with tears, and grease from food they never expected to taste again. Some clutched their jackets tightly, afraid the warmth inside them, not just from the food, but from the moment, might leak away. Others stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused, as if afraid that if they looked back too long, the mercy they had been shown might unravel into a misunderstanding. None of them spoke. Words felt dangerous. Silence felt safer. As the distance grew, a few boys finally turned their heads. Through the slats of the truck, they saw the Americans growing smaller. Figures in olive drab standing among ruins, no longer judges of life and death, but witnesses to something none of them would ever forget. The boys did not wave. They did not smile. Gratitude at that age and in that condition had no easy expression. What lingered instead was a quiet astonishment, the knowledge that the world, even at its cruelest, could still choose not to finish them off. Years later, some of those boys would struggle to explain that moment. They would speak of expecting execution, of bracing for death with the resignation of people too young to understand why they had been chosen to die. And then they would speak of hamburgers, of warmth, of grease soaking through paper, of hands that did not strike or shove but offered. Historians would debate the strategic meaning of such encounters, but for the boys, there was no debate. That single act fractured the certainty they had been taught, that enemies were monsters, that surrender meant humiliation or death, that mercy was weakness. In one quiet exchange, those lessons collapsed. Back in the village, the American soldiers eventually dispersed, pulled back into the machinery of a war that still demanded their obedience. Orders were followed. Positions were secured. Reports were filed. But beneath the routine, something lingered. Some of those men would later admit that the encounter haunted them more than firefights ever did. Killing an enemy, terrible as it was, fit the brutal logic of war. Sparing children who had been shaped into enemies forced them to confront something far worse. The realization that the war had consumed innocence so completely that mercy itself felt like rebellion. For the officers who recorded the incident, the language was clinical. Juvenile combatants encountered, disarmed and transferred. No mention of tears, no mention of shaking hands or food passed quietly from pack to child. History often preserves what is efficient, not what is human. And so moments like this slipped between the lines, surviving only in memory, in fragments told to families decades later, in half-finished sentences spoken by old men who paused too long before continuing. The boys were processed, separated from the uniforms that had turned them into targets. Some were sent home to villages that barely existed anymore. Others were placed in temporary camps where they slept without rifles for the first time in months. Many carried guilt they did not yet have words for. Guilt for surviving when others had not. Guilt for having worn a uniform associated with crimes they did not commit, but could not escape. The mercy they received did not erase their trauma, but it gave them something vital, proof that the world was not entirely broken. As Europe rebuilt itself from ash and bone, those children grew into men who carried quiet memories. Some became teachers, farmers, laborers. Some avoided talking about the war entirely. Others spoke of it rarely, carefully, as if touching something fragile that could still cut them. But again and again, when they did speak, the story returned to that single moment, standing against a wall, expecting bullets, and receiving food instead. In a war defined by annihilation, that contradiction shaped their understanding of humanity more than ideology ever could. For the Americans, the war would end months later. Parades would be held, medals awarded, photographs taken, yet no ceremony commemorated the decision not to kill. No monument marked the village where children were spared. The true impact of that choice lived quietly, invisibly, carried forward in lives that continued instead of ending. It lived in families that existed because boys were allowed to grow old. It lived in memories that refused to fade, even when the rest of the war blurred into noise. History often asks who won and who lost, who advanced and who retreated. It rarely asks who chose restraint when violence was permitted. But in that broken village in 1945, restraint mattered. It interrupted a cycle that had already claimed millions. It reminded both sides, however briefly, that war is made of decisions, not inevitabilities. And sometimes the most powerful decision is the one that leaves no visible scar on the ground, only an invisible mark on the soul.